Hey, what's up, y'all? My name is Stevie Matt, and today I'll be discussing Fast Color, released in 2018. Now, there was some major hype around this movie when it came out, at least in my circles, but it had a very limited release, and so I wasn't able to catch it properly at the time, so I know I'm late as hell, but better late than never. Anyway, it was directed by Julia Hart and written by Hart and Jordan Horowitz. Welcome to It's Not That Deep. This movie is a beautiful illustration of intergenerational healing, but the detail that I feel is very important in Ruth's story is the story behind her seizures. We get a sort of vague, strange things would happen explanation of how her powers operated differently from the others, right from jump. But that's okay because it is clearly a metaphor for something else, so you really have to pay attention to the language used here. Her mother explains that she was unable to nurture it, and that's when the seizures started, and that's when Ruth turned to drug use to try to, keep the seizures at bay. And we see later that Ruth is extremely powerful, able to change the energy of the earth itself, as Bill puts it, which manifests in moving tectonic plates in the earth that don't otherwise move or haven't otherwise moved historically, and bringing rain to places that haven't seen it in over 8 years, which is a major part of the film. So I interpreted Ruth's strange things to simply mean that, Ruth's power and ability were just far beyond her scope and her range, at no fault of her own. She was just a little out of her depth with Ruth's power, and that led to Ruth lacking control, and so that power unfortunately turning destructive. That's why the seizures started after Bo failed to properly nurture her abilities, and why the drugs worked at curbing her seizures, because the way I looked at it, at least, was that the seizures sort of represent that power being uncontrollably destructive, sort of destructive or self-destructive tendencies, and her drug addiction, as is usually the case with addiction, was her mechanism for coping with things that she was otherwise unable to address or resolve at that point in her life. And that's what I really appreciated about this movie, was that it framed, drug use as sort of a band-aid attempt at a solution rather than just the problem itself. But as is often the case with addiction, it's a means of coping by way of avoidance. So the source of the problem is not really being addressed, it's merely being avoided. You're running away from it. And sometimes that's necessary. But then sometimes, like with Ruth here, you hit a point where you can no longer run away from it. It's time. You hit a point where it's time to address it. It's time to face it head on and confront it and finally deal with it. And that's what brings her home. And what this story is really all about is healing. But not just her own, but healing for all three of them. Whatever was blocking her initially, from early on, the way that her seizures almost harmed her daughter is what became a major trigger, and that's what she had to address. And she had to do that by coming back home and actually building a relationship with her daughter instead of running away all the time in fear that she would fuck it up if she stayed. As she later saw, it was getting fucked up anyway. Without her even being there, Lila was about to take the exact same path that she did, running out into the world alone and unprepared, and that we find out later, the same path that her mother did as well. This was an ongoing cycle. And in the process, she discovers how to properly wield all of this power that she has inside of her, and in turn, that empowers her own mother to stop shrinking herself and step into her true power. And so this breaks this ongoing cycle, and it frees all three of them. But then, what about the rain, right? What was that all about? How did that connect to the story? So, because this movie revolves around two black women and a young black girl, and I am neither a black girl nor a black woman, therefore do not have the range, I looked up this article that was written by someone who is a black woman and therefore does have the range, and here's what she had to say about it. They may have extraordinary abilities, but the movie doesn't focus on what they can do for the dying world they're in. Instead, it centers around how they heal themselves and one another. It examines the idea of being unable to pour from an empty cup. And it's not until they all make peace with one another that they then go and offer themselves to the world. It's a breakaway from the popular narrative that black women will save us, which is meant to honor their strength and their intelligence and wisdom and so forth, but many black women have pushed against it because of the way that it ends up dehumanizing them in the process. In my Watchmen video, I shared a link to an article that echoed a lot of the issues that I had with the show's narrative, but that article, also written by a black woman, ended on this exact same note. And for some of us, it's an uncomfortable but oft-employed trope that assures its viewers to fear not the chaos of this violent world. Black women, strong, battle-tested, rife with loss and trauma, will save us. So instead of repeating that, this movie goes about subverting that trope so that the extreme drought that this world is suffering actually serves more as a backdrop than an aspect of the plot. These three lead characters have the power to save it, but as Steph explains in that first article, saving themselves first is the priority here. And that brings me to what I really love about this movie as an entry in the superhero canon. It has a lot of similar trappings of the genre. So, we have that shady government scientist who's hunting her down. He wants to test her and probably experiment on her. But other than that, it's really more of an indie film, TM, than anything else. And I say TM because it's not just indie, short for independent film, short for, not funded by a major studio, but indie in the way that, similar to like indie folk music or pop music, it's not just an umbrella term, but itself a kind of genre, one that has its own signature structures and pacing and style and so on and so forth. So most scenes are very quiet, everybody moves really slowly, they gaze forlornly into the distance. They speak in very short, broken, or fragmented sentences. We even enter into arguments and conflicts, sort of in the middle where the tension and the conflict has already built up prior to where we started the movie. So all we're getting in the argument is, more fragments and allusions to prior confrontations, and it's slow. Not bad slow, which is usually code for nothing's happening, but slow in that things happen, they're just very quiet things. So we start with an introduction to this dystopian world, starved of water. Then we meet Ruth, who is clearly on the run from something. Then we establish her quakes. We know that we don't know exactly what's going on with them yet, but we know that somehow she's connected to that earthquake that happens in the hotel. Then we meet the guy who's coming after her, the shady government scientist, and we get a little bit more of that there. So right there, and that's maybe the first 5-10 minutes of the film, you're getting world building, character, and plot. Because there are some movies I've watched where it's okay, here's a scene. That conversation was a little odd. Oh, okay, here's another scene. Okay, gazing forlornly into the distance. Beautiful shot. All right, and another scene. Driving now, but still gazing forlornly into the distance. Buying gas. The entire transaction plays out on screen. The sound of change sliding across the counter and the register clicking. Typical pleasantries. Driving again. Still gazing. Home now. A bleak living space. And it just goes on and on like that for so long. Just no plot. Just vibes. Now, no shade to you if that's your jam or something, but ooh, child, I just can't do it. I'm all about character, don't get me wrong, but it gets to a point sometimes with these movies where it's y'all ain't got no spare plot in the back. No zombies, no robot apocalypse, no dragons, nothing. And so this movie is very much not that. But it's also not your, typical blockbuster action superhero flick. It's the kind of superhero movie that Martin Scorsese could probably appreciate, which is why it's unfortunate that it got such a limited release that many were unable to see it. He was talking all that shit. He could have been helping distribute movies like this. See how they do? Anyway, real talk though, I do want to see more movies, more stories like this where you have superpowered characters, but the story is not so much about saving the world, or maybe not even stopping a bad guy. It's something more personal and intimate. The Umbrella Academy, which is on Netflix if you're unfamiliar with it, is a great example of a superhero narrative doubling as a metaphor for something more personal. But it still deals quite explicitly with saving the world. Twice so far. So even if saving the world is a metaphor for the state of their very dysfunctional family, at face value, it's still about saving the world. But here with Fast Color, you have an example of what that approach can look like in an even more contemplative form. You know, it sort of feels like the cinematic equivalent of magical realism, which is a genre of literature where everything in the world is normal, except for one magical or supernatural or surrealistic aspect that serves as an allegory for the story's themes. It's not quite that for some petty mechanical reasons, but that's all I kept thinking about when I was watching this movie, is how I'd love to see more magical realism in cinema, whatever that may look like. Not saying that it doesn't exist, just that off the top of my head I can't think of anything, and that I haven't seen it, and I would really like to change that. So that's all I got for you today. I do not share a lot of the same major hang-ups about superhero movies that, like, you know, the fancy elite critics and cinephiles do. But I do feel like we need more entries like this one that really stretch how superpowers can serve a story thematically, and to see it applied in more personal, intimate stories like this one. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button to show some love. Feel free to drop a comment down below. And while you're at it, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. Check me out on Twitter and Ko-fi for more ways to show support and stay up to date. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I'll see you in the next video.